What do I fear about death? I think I fear the loss of my own imperfections, my own flaws, what makes me unique. If I didn't fear the loss of these things, then the solution to a fear of death would be the hope that there's something that's coming next that's going to be better than me. And this fear, I think, is both something you can feel on an individual level, but also people feel it on a collective level. The anxiety that people have about being replaced in a global sense, whether it's an ethnic sense, or whether we're talking about technology, whether we're talking about culture, this feeling of being replaced, of being replaceable, of being interchangeable. This is something that we fear on an instinctual level. We care more about ourselves than we care about the goodness of the world, or the world being a better, beautiful, harmonious place. So we are tied up in our own egos, in our own Darwinian egoism, that we want to survive, we want to thrive, we want to continue, even if that means preventing better things from coming into existence. And I'm talking here about the life of the individual, and I'm talking about the life of collective organisms in a Spenglerian sense. But I'm also talking about character development and the person as a set of habits. So you can have a vision of yourself as being tied up with your flaws. And it can be scary to imagine that there's going to be a different form of yourself. And even if that form is better by your own evaluation. So, people who have a relationship with unhealthy foods, and they can conceive of themselves as being better if they change their diet. But at the same time, I think there is this very egoistic fear in this brutal, primordial, primeval sense that Schopenhauer talks about as the will, despite the fact that aesthetically and all sorts of preferential ways we might prefer to be better people, but on some basic sense we fear change. Even if it's change for the better, we fear losing that which we know, that which we have, because there is this image, Ein Sof, there's this infinite chaos, this infinite nothingness, darkness upon the face of the depths. That is this primordial God of the atheist. Even if you don't believe in God, when we conceive of death, there are different pictures that we can have in our mind. And one of the earliest I ever had was of a straight line, a straight black line, surrounded by a sea of light and whiteness. So the straight black line represents the masculine division between the heavens and the earth, and it's in harmony. It's a straight black line reflecting perfect light and order. And that line it's a reverse of what you see in those doctors' shows where the person is flatlining. So first you have the heartbeat and it's boop, 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 and then it flatlines, and that's bad. But this picture image of mine is the reverse. So the picture image is that first you have a straight black line with white and white on top and bottom, and it's just traveling along harmoniously, undisturbed, like an unperturbed field of water. And then all of a sudden there's bumps and there's wrinkles and there's disturbances, and this line goes up and down and up and down and up and down, and eventually this black line, it overtakes the scene, and darkness overtakes and chaos overtakes, and there is no white left. So that's one way of viewing death. And another way of viewing death is just in this pure nothingness, this pure, what if I didn't exist? What if my personality didn't exist? My identity didn't exist? I wasn't able to perceive the world. There's this extreme sense of infinite nothingness. You're never going to be able to retrieve yourself. There's no process to which you can bring your flaws back. You could theoretically get better, with reincarnation. You could become better, you could become worse, but ultimately it would be different. You could never retrieve your individuality or uniqueness. And I'm not sure if this is a specific problem of Western civilization. This conception, as John David Ebert talks about, the Grail quester, and the bear, and the concept of the lone hunt, or the Faustian spirit, that Western culture conceives of. The first problem being we conceive of our uniqueness, and our uniqueness as an organism, culturally, mythologically, through taps into a sense of will, an egoistic drive for survival, as Schopenhauer described. And so there is this extreme force of thanatos, of death, bearing down on us when we conceive of the loss of individuality. And I think this is part of the reason why Faustian civilization views freedom as the ultimate virtue, because freedom allows for our individuality. Without freedom, we can't be individuals. If we have rules and laws and constraints, that collectivizes us, and it makes us indistinguishable from one another. So this is, I think, why we fear a loss of freedom. Ultimately, freedom, I don't think, is the core value here. I think the core value is individuality. And from our individuality, we then see freedom as the guarantee of individuality. And without freedom, there can be no individuality. But individuality is the most fundamental value here. And this is why I think Westerners have this existential crisis in a way that other cultures don't necessarily have, because I think other cultures are not so wrapped up in the concept of individuality. They're not so wrapped up in the concept of freedom. It's not to say that they don't have a conception of it, but that Western culture has taken this concept of individuality and it has sacralized it to the point where it is of infinite value beyond all other values. And that is why Western individuals, like these French existentialists or whatever, and just the Western person in the modern day, has such an extreme fear of death, and why Westerners conceive of death as this infinite nothingness, because we don't conceive ourselves as part of a collective, as a true organic collective. We don't conceive of something coming after us. We don't conceive of people around us living on after us to the degree that other cultures might. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is something that will change. Maybe at some point you're going to see these other cultures westernize and become just as obsessed with freedom, and just as obsessed with individuality, and just as obsessed with thanatos and the fear of death and trying to prolong life, because that's what we have in our culture. One of the biggest public expenditures and private expenditures in a person's life is on healthcare. And the interesting thing about healthcare is it's really important, because if you are a mother or you're a father and you're trying to raise children, you want them to have access to healthcare. If your children get sick and they have no access to healthcare, well, we already know what that looks like. Just 100 years ago, in places like Eastern Europe, you saw death rates of 50% during World War I, World War II. Child mortality was extremely high. Extremely high. So people would have, 10 kids and 5 would survive. And that's the way it was. And so for parents, they want access to healthcare. They don't want to have 10 kids and have 5 of them die. They want to have less kids and ensure their survival. So they need access to healthcare. Healthcare costs money. So the people who really need it most, I think, are young people. It's parents and their children really need free access to healthcare. Now, the problem is, when we look at the number of dollars being spent on healthcare in America, and increasingly around the world, it is mostly spent on the elderly in the last 6 months of life. So this is essentially life support, end-of-life care. People who are having cancer surgery in their 90s, people who are having all kinds of different, surgery, slips, falls, nursing homes, extremely expensive. If you start looking at, it's interesting, if you start looking at various parts of the United States and you look at who's the biggest employer, well, there's a different question which I've referred to before, which is the question of which jobs are most popular. And oftentimes the two most popular jobs are teacher, or work in the field of education, and then the other job is truck driver, or some variation on that. You're transporting goods from one place to another. Driving is a huge part of your job. So those two jobs, truck driver, educator, one is more fragile than the other. Being a truck driver, obviously, if Tesla takes over and self-driving trucks become a thing, then millions of Americans are going to be instantly out of work. And the idea that those Americans can just become computer programmers is a little bit naive or duplicitous. I think some of the people who are suggesting that are lying about the effects of age on mental plasticity. So maybe you can train young people to be computer programmers, although that's even questionable and denies, the idea that there is a gradient of human intelligence, or that human intelligence, differences in human intelligence might be have some heritable component. Not, of course, not completely 100% heritable. That's ridiculous. But the idea that there might be some heritable component there, I think people are either in denial or they're lying about that if they think that that's not going to be disastrous. But one of the things that people rarely, when we look at what is the most popular job, and you look at a map of America and you see truck driver, school teacher. But one really big industry that's going to become bigger and bigger as time goes on is this healthcare industry, so nurses. And this is a lot of end-of-life care, and this is a lot of nursing homes. And you look at some counties in the United States, and the biggest, and you look down the list, just look at, and you can find this data online, you start looking at who are the top employers in various counties in the United States. And you see, well, the hospital is a big employer, and then you've got this nursing home, and then you have this pediatrician, and then you go down the list and you're like, this is all medical care. So a huge number of Americans are now involved in some way with this care of the elderly. And increasingly what you're seeing is that a lot of the service industry in America, because we're moving away from the time of industrialization, we're moving away from having factories, building cars, those sort of things. Now America's moving away from producing goods. We're now moving toward providing services. So when you think of who is purchasing these services, so we're thinking about manual laborers. We're thinking about essentially people hiring others to do work for them. And increasingly, this is because you have elderly people who have saved up a lot of money and they can't physically perform basic tasks anymore. Whatever those tasks might be, we think about home remodeling, the real estate agency, landscaping, all these manual labor jobs. A lot of the money is tied up with the fact that we have an aging elderly population that has all this money stored up, and they're just spending it on having other people do these jobs that they physically can't do or don't want to do themselves. So the economy is increasingly dependent upon this elderly wealthy class. Some ridiculous number, like 50% of people over the age of 60 are millionaires. Some ridiculous numbers that you wouldn't think would be possible, but it's just the fact that these people, grew up in the some of the most prosperous times of American history, and they have all these assets saved up. They have the car, they have the boat, they have the house, and so it might not be that they have $1 million in the bank account, but they have stocks, they have bonds, they have indexes, whatever. So you're looking at this, and our economy is structured. We're just feeding everything in the economy, from the medical industry to the service industries. So much of our economy is just towards satisfying the needs and desires and wants of elderly people who are no longer producing anything. They simply exist to retire and to relax and to enjoy the twilight years of their life, the golden years of their life, as commercials and advertisements and marketing executives have popularized that phrase, the golden years of life. rather than the dusky years or the dark years or something like that, which would probably be more accurate. And we're so much of economic activity is going toward feeding the needs and desires of these people, and we're neglecting to focus on, okay, well, people can't start families because the healthcare is too expensive, and land is too expensive, and renting an apartment is too expensive. So all of these economic costs are put on young people. The cost of college, okay. Whereas old people, everything seems to be free for them. They get all of these benefits, senior discount. They have all the money. It seems like a lopsided situation here. If I was to come in as some kind of Bernie Sanders reformer, I wouldn't be talking about the 99% against the 1%, because I think that's too ambiguous and people don't really understand what we're talking about there. I would speak in more clear terms that everyone can see about economically, it is a fight of the younger generation versus the older generation, where the older generation is non-productive, the old generation is a consumer class, the older generation is incurring so much of the costs of healthcare. The older generation is, paying for all of these services, so redirecting the energy of the economy toward them, rather than, why are we giving free healthcare to older people? Why aren't we giving free healthcare to the people who need it most, who are young people? Now, I say that who need it most. Obviously, older people have more need of healthcare because they're more sickly. But at the same time, imagine if the economy was changed up like that. Imagine if it was said that, hey, look, if you're old and you want to be like Jeff Epstein, who wanted to live forever, you're going to have to pay for it. And if you're young, it's just free. That would be a natal policy. But it's the opposite. It's the opposite. We started off with a very deep philosophical topic, I guess, death, existentialism, and we ended up with a economic argument. Unfortunately, I don't have time to continue with this stream of consciousness, so I'm going to end it there, and we will pick up in a following video.